The Ashmolean Museum is one of the most important institutions in Oxford. It's allegedly the oldest public museum in the world. And it's free unless you're going to an exhibition. And it's named after an astrologer, Elias Ashmole, who the museum was founded in 1683. And Ashmole was an intellectual, a public intellectual, I suppose you'd call him now, a politician and a kind of macher behind the scenes at the time of, during the Civil War in this country, and then at the Restoration, which is when Charles II took the throne back. And he was on the side of the royalists, but his great astrologer friend, William Lilly, was on the side of the parliamentarians during the Civil War. And I think he helped Lilly not to get into big trouble when the royalists got back into power. Anyway, that's all some background stuff. Ashmole himself, though, was also obviously a collector. He collected stuff, he collected knowledge, he collected books. He collected other people's collections. And in fact, this museum, the main part of the collection, the kernel, the core of the collection belonged to John Tredescant, who sold it to Ashmole, I think. Or was it his descendants sold it to Ashmole? Anyway, it was this collection of very interesting objets, a cabinet of curiosities. Ashmole himself, as you would guess from my description of him, was a Gemini with a Sun-Mercury conjunction, and Gemini rising, because he was an astrologer, we have his exact birth time, which was 3:28 a.m. on the 23rd of May, 1617. And he had, but appropriately for someone who's a collector and interested in the organization of knowledge, he has Jupiter in the sign of Aquarius on the midheaven, also appropriate for someone who's really interested in politics. He spent his life between politics and collecting and conversations. He was interested in conversations. And in fact, if you go in the museum, one of the things that he gave to the Ashmolean to start the collection was a collection of his own portraits of some of his friends, which included, I just jotted it down, William Lilly, obviously, the famous Renaissance astrologer who wrote the complete, who wrote Christian astrology, sorry. But there's also a portrait, so that's Lilly. Then there's a portrait of Nicholas Fiske, who was a medical astrologer, and these three were good friends. He also donated a portrait of John Dee, who was, of course, the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, who chose the date for her coronation and got into a lot of trouble. That was a generation or two earlier. And Napier also. And actually Napier was an associate of Dee, whose papers Ashmole had. So there's you can still see the portraits. I wanted to say that he is this Gemini. And one of the things I find interesting about his very interesting chart is that he has a Mercury in Gemini making conjunction to Vesta, which is the asteroid that I often find is to do with what we leave behind, our inheritance, and the inheritance that we leave for our descendants. So he wanted to leave something. He wanted to leave knowledge, and that's what museums are about. They're about places that are full of knowledge. As you know, not only do people have horoscopes, but a building can have a horoscope, or an institution. Now, the current Ashmolean, this building that you see, is not the original building, but the original building, the original museum, we have a birth date for it. It was born on the 24th of May, 1683, with a conjunction between the Sun and Gemini, just like its founder, Elias. A conjunction but this Mercury is at 0 degrees Gemini, 0 tenths, just in Gemini, and the Sun is at 3 degrees Gemini, so it's early Gemini. Now, when you cast a chart for a building, if you can, obviously you want to put it, cast it for when the building was first opened to the public, this kind of public building. But if you can't, if you don't know that, you can cast it for midday, which I've done for this one. But the thing that I find really interesting within this our current debate around museums and the contents of museums and colonialism, etc., is the fact that Uranus, which is a planet, if you read my blog, you'll find this, that I talk about this in a few places, that I associate, among its many other attributes, that Uranus is about the mind. It's about inspiration. Of course, that's what a museum does. It inspires you. It broadens your mind. It's also a planet that I find is associated, you find it's like a time machine. So you find people who write science fiction or who write historical fiction often have these very close contacts between Uranus and their Sun, for example. But anyway, Uranus in this chart is also at 0 degrees. It's at 0 degrees of Taurus, which is a sign we associate with buildings and structures, things that are actually built. So we have a building that is a literal time machine. You go into this museum and you are taken backwards in time for the most part, but to different periods of history, etc. And any museum will do that. But this Uranus makes a conjunction with Chiron, the wounded healer, or the wound, at 1 degree of Taurus. So there's already a little bit of dubiousness there about this, what it's about material culture. That's also a very Taurian concept, the concept of material culture, which is what we're seeing in museums, but about this acquisition of material culture, how it's acquired. I think that that combination of the wounded healer with the time machine, what are we doing there? So we're kind of preserving stuff, which is great, but we're also taking it out of its context by sticking it in a museum. It's interesting that this institution is a Gemini institution. It's about knowledge, acquiring lots of little objects, little bits of knowledge, with a Taurus moon. So it's got this very earthy soul. And if I do the noon chart, it's got Virgo rising. So it is a museum where I have to say, looking at the detail is very enjoyable. And that's where you find a lot of the interest. And the moon makes a nice conjunction, trine to that Virgo. And the other thing, just one more thing that I think is quite interesting about this, it's called the Ashmolean Museum, right? So he made sure that it was named after him, right? That because he has managed to make his name live for hundreds of years, more than most people. I mean, I guess the Smithsonian is another example, the Ashmolean, the Smithsonian. But there's not many museums named after a person that have carried on for that long. And I think it's interesting that the Vesta in his own chart is in the first house, making this conjunction to the Sun. So it's like the name continues. He's passed on his name to us.